Everybody ready? Okay, good evening, everybody, and welcome
Well, you're running with him.
to the December 10th, 2018 Lake Bluff Village Board. Can I have the roll call, please?
Trustee Ankman? Here. Trustee Dewart?
Here.
Trustee Grenier?
Here.
Trustee Lemieux?
Here.
Trustee Meyer?
Here.
Trustee Toll?
Here. Would everybody please stand for the pledge? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay. Awards and proclamation tonight, and we have a proclamation designating December 2018 as National Drunk and Drugged Driving Prevention Month. Whereas the Illinois Department of Transportation, Illinois fatal crash data reported there were 883 fatal crashes and a total of 962 fatalities in Illinois as of December 4th, 2018. Whereas hundreds of these deaths involved a driver impaired by alcohol and/or drugs, and whereas the December holiday season is one of the deadliest times of the year for impaired driving, and whereas for thousands of families across the state and the nation, holidays are a time to remember loved ones lost, and whereas organizations across the state and the nation are engaged in the Drive Sober or Get Pulled Over enforcement effort and other campaigns that foster public awareness of the dangers of impaired driving and anti-impaired driving law enforcement efforts. And whereas the Village of Lake Bluff is proud to partner with the Illinois Department of Transportation's Division of Traffic Safety and other safety groups in an effort to make our roads and streets safer. Now therefore, I, Kathleen O'Hara, Village President of the Village of Lake Bluff, Illinois, do hereby proclaim the month of December 2018 as Drunk and Drug Driving Prevention Month in the Village of Lake Bluff, and call upon all citizens, government agencies, business leaders, hospitals and healthcare providers, schools and public and private institutions to promote awareness of the impaired driving problem, to support programs and policies to reduce the incident of impaired driving, and to promote safer and healthier behaviors regarding the use of alcohol and other drugs this holiday season and throughout the year. Okay. We have, the next is the consideration of the minutes of the November 26, 2018 Village Board meeting. Do I have a motion?
So moved.
So moved by, Mr. Toll. Do I have a second?
Second.
And second by Mr. Grenier. Any corrections or additions? All right, hearing none, all in favor?
Aye.
Thank you. At this point in time, the village trustees and village president allot 15 minutes for anyone who might like to speak for any item that is not, for something that is not on tonight's agenda to address the board. Is there anybody here that would like to do so? Okay. We are now going with the village finance report. We have the warrant report for for December 1 through 15 and November 2018 payroll expenditures. Do I have a motion, please?
So moved.
To approve.
So moved. So moved.
So moved by Mr. Dewitt, and a second.
Second.
Second,
Mr. Meyer.
Mr. Meyer, thank you. All right, we have at this point expenditure of village funds for payment of invoices in the amount of $393,050.58 for December 1 through 15. We have expenditure of village funds for payroll in the amount of $300,523.95 for November, which are total expenditures of $693,574.53. Do we have any Comments or questions for our finance director regarding the warrant report? Hearing none, would there be a roll call, please?
Trustee Ankerman?
Aye.
Trustee Dewar?
Aye.
Trustee Grenier?
Aye.
Trustee Lemieux?
Aye.
Trustee Meyer?
Aye.
Trustee Toll?
Aye.
At this point, we also have the November 2018 financial report. Do I have a motion to accept?
So moved.
So moved by Mr. Dewar and a second.
Second.
Second by Mr. Lemieux. And I'll ask for the highlights from our finance director.
Sure. Sales tax and home rule tax revenues restated from the October report, as we haven't received the vouchers yet from the state because this month's report is earlier than usual. I did include on page 5 for your information, and I'll update that sheet each month, a sales tax by commercial sector that outlines the sales tax by SIC code as per the Illinois Department of Revenue. Building permit revenue for fiscal year 19, May through November, is $273,275 compared to the $407,280, which is on the corrected sheet that you have at the counter at your seats. Fiscal year 19 expenditures of $5,388,089 are $834,700 greater than the expenditures for the same period of FY18, and current expenditures are consistent or less than with budget.
Any questions or comments, finance director? Okay, hearing none. All in favor of receipt of this report?
Aye.
Thank you. Village administrators report.
Thank you. Wait a second for this to come up, but I did have one item that's in your packet, which is an informational update from the Ad Hoc Beach Parking Committee, who's met twice now, as recently as last week. And Trustee Toll is the chair of that committee, and he and I talked about maybe tag teaming this report, but just a really quick overview is that the group, again, has met twice in probably almost 10 hours in those 2 meetings. But the general summary is the group is recommending some changes to the parking regulations close to the lakefront. And again, the goals of these are to manage some public safety concerns and quality of life issues. And I'm trying to bring up this exhibit. But really quickly, Mountain Road at the north side of this drawing here is currently signed, no parking, as is Sunrise Avenue on the far east side there. Sunrise Avenue is on the books as no parking, Mountain Road is not, even though it's signed as much, and we want to clean up the code and address that, and the group recommended to do that. There was also a goal to manage those north-south streets, Maple and Simpson, which are very narrow, right around 18 feet in width, and they don't have curb and or take a beating really, and the parkways get beaten up over the years. A concern again is public safety and ensuring that public safety vehicles can move along those easily. And in the summertime, when those streets get very crowded with beachgoers, that becomes very difficult, if not impossible at times. So the group ad hoc committee originally spoken about actually only limiting one side of those north-south streets. But based off some feedback from folks attending the meeting from the neighborhood, it actually said, why don't you go ahead and make them both no parking. And then likewise on the east-west of East Prospect there between Maple and Sunrise, to limit that to one side of the street, just like Scranton is. It was decided not to go all the way to Moffett with that due to the church and how that property is used in a non-residential way, but also, again, the goal is to really manage that area closest to the beach. And East Prospect, from observations, is not as heavily trafficked for beach traffic as Center and or East Scranton, or Maple and Simpson even. So, but that's it in a nutshell. As far as the regulatory changes, there is another change which I'll highlight. That's being recommended, and this idea was plucked from our friends down south in Kenilworth. This is a section of East Center from Sunrise westerly to Maple, where the group thought that the stalls could actually be delineated on the road, not like shown here, just for clarity's sake. These large blocks, it would be done in a very minimal way, but in a clear way enough that the police could enforce that to control the volume of parking along these streets. This area of the village is very heavily trafficked during the summer months, and the residents in this area experience some quality of life concerns and issues. And the ad hoc committee recommended piloting this program, and the village is going to try to find a way to demarcate this in a quasi-permanent way to make sure it's going to do what the people think it's going to do. But right here, you can see these stalls. It's really going to work out to be in this 2-block section as marked. It's 35 stalls. And a good example is in this area right here. There's 2 cars there parked today, but under this new program, there'd only be 1 and be allowed to park in that area. And it's really reducing the density. It would go from roughly, I think it was 47 down to 35 that would be normally parked there. So it's really spreading out the intensity of parking. So when you think about this being put in place east to west, and then these north-south streets being limited to no parking, it's going to reduce the density, the high impact density in this area. All this was discussed roughly at the same time the Park District was doing a number of changes to their policies, which I've listed here, which includes 5 of them, first one is elimination of non-resident annual beach memberships. They're also increasing the beach pass fees for non-residents, and increasing the pass for an annual dog park pass for non-residents, and changing a policy so there would be no free passes for employees of businesses within the Park District. And a new weekend shelter rental regulation would include limiting the uses of the shelters from midnight down to 11 p.m. on weekends. And also, they've had a past practice of distributing 75 parking passes for somebody renting a shelter, and they're going to cut that down to 25. So if you have out-of-town guests coming, that cuts down considerably the number of those vehicles that would be permitted to come.
Can I point out that will mess up the Cub Scouts who sleep there at least once a year?
So that was talked about, and
Okay.
so there'd be they were going to try to way to work through some of those wrinkles like that for little one-off events that happen from time to time.
Yeah, because that's a great event, and I'd hate to see that constrained.
I don't know if I missed anything.
I think you covered it very well. One of the really important things, though, is that we are working with the Park District on this. It is a Park District facility, the beach is. And so the coordination between the quote-unquote designated parking area on village streets for the Park District facility, being the beach, requires that we cooperate quite a bit on this. So we will be in continuous discussions with the Park District, hopefully to ensure that their regulations are enforced as far as who is getting in as a resident and who is required to pay the non-resident fee, as an example. So, and again, this is also just a starting point. Anything that we look at, we're going to be doing a focus group with some residents, and changes can be made. We're hoping to have this instituted for next beach season, potentially, May 1st or somewhere abouts there. And whatever this board decides can be changed. We're committed to staying nimble on this, and if something doesn't work, then we want to be able to adjust it as well.
Yeah, I think that's right. That was a big point, was the data that this group was relying on, the Park District had collected over a few years, and there was concern about the quality of the data, and the idea that that's one of the major, I would call a footnote to all this, is if the village is if they're going to recommend that, they being the committee are going to recommend these regulatory changes, that there has to be a very strong effort by the village and the Park District to collect good data, and that the group was interestingly very demanding that the village play a role in that, even though it's a Park District facility. But the group said the village has got to be part of it because of the quality of life issues. They're all interrelated. But that was a big, loud exclamation point from the group, that collecting good data And so that this could be, we could be nimble, and that the village could adjust this if we get different data next year and try to modify the situation based off the data that we collect. So,
Thank you.
Go ahead, Mark.
I was just to say thank you to Trustee Toll for bringing this to really facilitating a really constructive resolution here.
And we've had a lot of help from the residents as well.
Yeah.
So it hasn't just been the committee. We've had some very constructive feedback and cooperation and coordination with the residents. in the Park District.
Ditto Mark's comments. I thought you handled a difficult situation well. I had a couple of questions, and it may be the trial nature of this and the words nimble address my concerns, but with regard to the larger parking places, I think that's a good solution. I like that. I'm just wondering if it doesn't create a problem as you move west from Maple. So, you know, I guess my question was, why don't we continue that to Moffett? And maybe the answer was, you're going to try it on a trial basis.
Yeah, I
and
think the
see.
consensus was we would try this, knowing that we would be pushing some of the parking somewhere else.
Uh-huh.
And whether that's, I mean, it's likely west on Center, especially because we're restricting the north-south streets as well. But, you know, if we find that strict enforcement of the Park District regulations creates lower demand for parking places, we didn't want to paint
Okay,
unnecessarily.
good. Yeah, I like that thinking.
It occurred to me from a safety standpoint, enlarging those stalls is probably positive as people remove things from the car and kids and stuff from the back of their minivans and SUVs.
Yep,
And
and the other thing is, we also wanted to ensure that there was some clearance for driveways as well. So there is a 10 feet on either side of each driveway where, before there's allowed parking. So
Well, I
that will
love
also
that.
create some additional safety.
The other question I had is, and I'm sure you considered this, but why not put larger stalls on Scranton as well? Because it seems to me, I go up and down Scranton more than I go down Center, and it seems to me Scranton gets pretty crazy as well.
It does, yeah.
Yeah, you would
You know, I think, again, Center tends to be the first area that fills up.
Okay.
And so, you know, if we find that the demand from stricter enforcement, it could just be a non-issue.
Okay, fair enough. Thank you.
But, you know, if we find that we do need to do it next year, or even if we could fit it in this upcoming season, you know, that's definitely a possibility.
I had two comments. One of the things that maybe you can look at when we implement this, one thing that I can see might happen as we push parking back up Moffett, or back up Center, that you may have situations where more people go and get the car and bring it down to the beach to pick people up because of the distance, and you may end up potentially increasing the traffic right there at the, you know, at the Bluff. So it'd be something I'd look at to see if something like that happens. One other question that I had was, what's the thinking on parking on one side of the street on Scranton on Prospect? What's the accomplishment? Or
Well,
what are you
Scranton
trying to
is
do?
already that way. There's no parking on the north side of
I mean,
Scranton.
it's
Yeah.
one way to Moffett now, or on one side to
one
Moffett
side,
now, and then
Correct.
after that, it goes to.
it stays the same, no change to that.
Yeah, so that's no change. The thinking by restricting on Prospect is that we will be spreading the parking out, and so
Okay.
we're just kind of to make it uniform, and
Okay.
and knowing that we'll spread some of the parking out and potentially to Prospect, so we just wanted to get ahead of that.
So just to be, I guess I didn't realize that Scranton, a street that I live on, there's only parking on one side of the street legally
Yes.
at this point?
Yes. Correct.
Because right now, it's both sides. It goes all over the place.
Yeah, no parking on the north side of Scranton,
Huh, okay. Well,
and it is signed as such.
okay.
I do have one other idea. I hate to complicate this. Could you go back to the parking stall aspect of this? And I suppose this is a question for Aaron and to echo everybody else. Thank you, Aaron, for all the hard work on this. Have we considered perhaps having one or more, the stall one, if you could, Drew? The stalls, the little squares.
Oh, I'm sorry.
The stalls. Have we considered having one or two of those stalls demarcated for the handicapped, so that if somebody wants to
We,
enjoy at least, I know they'd want to drive down the ramp if it's going to be the beach, but at least enjoy the park area that's there, that there would be some accommodation to make sure that they'd be able to end up towards the front.
Sure. We did discuss that a little bit, and I guess we didn't really talk about somebody who didn't want to go down to the beach, just wanted to enjoy the top of the bluff and the park there. I guess the consensus was that there is handicap parking down the ramp. I guess we didn't consider that part. but
Yeah, well,
we do need to.
a couple things about it. One is that it may well reduce further the density, which I think is one of the goals at least that you've considered. And the other is that, well, it would create, what you're doing by pushing the parking down Maple, down Center here, is that if somebody is handicapped and they don't get a reserved space, they're going to have to
Sure.
travel further to, to get to where they're going. So that's the reason I raise it. I don't know if it's
Good point.
something anybody wants to consider.
Yeah, we
Anyone
noted.
else?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, so the next steps, just again to verify, we're going to take this information out, share it with the neighborhood, and if there's any other feedback, bring it back in the form of an ordinance to amend these regulations. And the others, they have some budget implications, but very little. But anyway, so you'll see it again in early January.
Good.
Thank you.
Thank you, Aaron.
Thank you, Aaron, and thank the rest of the committee for
Yes.
putting a lot of work on this one. All right, do you have anything else for your report?
That concludes my report.
was it. Village Attorney's report.
No report tonight.
No report. Village President's report. This is the only meeting for the month because the next meeting would fall on Christmas Eve, and we will not be meeting that, and the holiday season is upon us, and we all wish everybody a very happy holiday season. All right, we have, going to number 11, we have acceptance of the correspondence that was delivered to the village board, an informational report on November 21st and 30th. Do I have a motion to accept?
So moved.
So moved by Ms. Ankerman, and do I have a
Second.
second by Mr. Grenier? All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you. We now have the second reading of an ordinance levying property taxes for the fiscal year beginning May 1st, 2018, and ending April 30th, 2019, for the village of Lake Bluff. This is second reading. Do I have a motion, please?
So moved.
So moved by Mr. Dewar, and a second.
Second.
Second
Meyer.
by Mr. Meyer, thank you. I will, because this is important to pursuant to state law, on or before the last Tuesday in December, the village must file with the county clerk an ordinance requesting a property tax to be levied on all taxable property within the village. After review of levy estimates and financial projections as presented by staff, the Finance Committee recommends that the village levy $3,379,109 for the year 2018, which represents a 2.45 increase over the 2017 property tax extension. The Lake Bluff Public Library Board has amended their property tax levy request to $964,117 for the year 2018, which is a 4.62 increase over the previous year. The levy ordinance includes this increased request that was approved by the Finance Committee at their November 29, 2018 meeting. The total levy amount is $4,343,227. The tax extension is based on county calculations, and while not anticipated, the library levy request may exceed the limiting rate, which could then change the library's apportioned amount. Do we have any questions before we vote on this? Any comments for the finance director? All right, hearing none, roll call, please.
Trustee Dewar.
Aye.
Trustee Grenier.
Aye.
Trustee Lemieux.
Aye.
Trustee Meyer.
Aye.
Trustee Toll.
Aye.
Trustee Hinkman. Aye.
Okay. Did I lose? Sorry. An ordinance abating the 2018 property tax levied for general obligation debt series 2011-2012 bonds of the Village of Lake Bluff, Lake County, Illinois. Second reading. Do I have a motion, please?
So moved.
So moved by Mr. Dewart, and a second.
Second.
Second by Ms. Ankerman. The village currently has refunded bond series 2011 and 2012 general obligation bonds outstanding pursuant to ordinances 2011-19 and 2012-13. The county clerk is required to extend a property tax levy in the amount sufficient to pay the interest and principal on the bonds. In the past, the village has abated the annual property tax levy. Because the bond ordinances directing extension of the annual property tax levy were filed with the county clerk, an ordinance is required to abate, not levy, the property tax for these bonds. The finance director determined that the Water Works Fund has the amount necessary to transfer to the Water Works bond and interest account for principal and interest payments on the 2011 refunding bonds. The 2012 refunding bond principal and interest payments will be paid by general fund revenues. The village board did approve first reading of this ordinance at its meeting on November 16th. Any questions or things regarding second reading of this? Hearing none, roll call, please.
Trustee Grenier?
Aye.
Trustee Lemieux?
Aye.
Trustee Meyer?
Aye.
Trustee Toll?
Aye.
Trustee Ankman? Aye. Trustee Dewart?
Aye.
Now I have an ordinance amending the Lake Bluff zoning regulations regarding building height in the L1 Light Industry District, L2 Limited Light Industry District, and Service District, and off-street parking standards in various districts. This is second reading. And for clarification, I actually will read this again. At its October regular meeting, the PCZBA held a public hearing to consider changes to height and parking regulations in the village's L1 Light Industry District, which is the general area bounded to the north by Route 176, to the west by Waukegan Road, to the east by Route 41, and to the south by Lake Forest. At the conclusion of the public hearing, the PCZBA recommended unanimously that the board adopt the attached text amendments. The changes were requested by the PCZBA as a result of a preliminary workshop for a medical office development at the old Smedbow property, which was 999 and 1001 Sherwood Drive, at its September meeting. The changes include increase in the height from 25 foot to, in the L1 district, from 25 foot to 32 feet. And we'll go on. Parking near Waukegan Road, allow parking within 50 feet of Waukegan Road, reduced from 100 feet. Parking areas, adjust the parking regulations to be more permissive of front yard and side yard parking. Many of the developments within the district already include parking in these areas under allowances for visitor and executive parking. Parking dimensions, adjust the parking regulations to mirror the aisle and stall dimensions in effect in the central business district. Do we have any questions regarding the second reading of this ordinance? All in favor, then?
You need a motion.
Aye.
No, did I not do that? I'm sorry.
I need a roll call.
No, it says voice vote. I did a roll call.
reading?
Second.
Second reading.
Okay. Could I have a motion, please?
So moved.
Second.
Moved by Mr. Dewitt and second by Mr. Meyer. Thank you. Roll call. Roll call, please.
Trustee Lemieux?
Aye.
Trustee Meyer?
Aye.
Trustee Toll?
Aye.
Trustee Ankman? Aye. Trustee Dewart?
Aye.
Trustee Grenier?
Aye.
Okay. Item number 15, which is an ordinance amending the Lake Bluff Municipal Code regarding historic preservation. Do I have a motion?
So moved.
So moved by Mr. Lemieux. Thank you. And second?
Second.
Second by Mr. Toll.
Madam President, I wanted to disclose that I work for the architect.
Yes, I'm sorry,
And
yes.
so I would like to recuse myself.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Lemieux. The preservation of historically, culturally, and architecturally significant residential properties in the village is necessary to maintain the essential character of the village and to protect the value of properties in the village. The village desires to promote the preservation of older homes while ensuring that homeowners are provided flexibility to adapt all homes to the changing needs of family and the community. On February 12th, 2001, the Lake Bluff Board of Trustees adopted the village's historic preservation ordinance as ordinance number 2001-03, which amended the Lake Bluff Municipal Code to provide a set of regulations for the designation and protection of landmarks within the village, so-called the Historic Preservation Ordinance. The Historic Preservation Ordinance has been amended several times since its adoption in 2001 to make the preservation of landmarks within the village more efficient and to better advance the village's goals. The proposed amendments are recommended to make the process for designating a property as a landmark more efficient and to add additional clarity to the Lake Bluff Municipal Code. The board considered first reading of the ordinance at its November 26th meeting. Drew, do you have,
I think Village Attorney Friedman and myself are going to tag team this a little bit.
So we have a PowerPoint that I'll walk us through, that we'll both walk us through. So the PowerPoint's going to take us through a summary of the current preservation protections and provisions, a general summary of the amendments in English, a more detailed explanation of the amendments, and get into a little bit of the nitty-gritty, and then we'll take any questions and answers, obviously, that the board may have. The current, our current preservation ordinance can be divided into three key elements. And I'm going to skip over the first and talk about the second two first. As you all know, properties can be nominated for landmark status. There's an application process. The Historic Preservation Commission reviews those, makes a recommendation, and the village board landmarks properties by the adoption of an ordinance. The village, the commission, the Vliet Center, and the property owner are all possible applicants for landmarks. Once something is landmarked, then if there is a desire to demolish that landmark structure, there is what is called an advisory review period. That advisory review period is simply an opportunity for the Historic Preservation Commission, the village board, the village itself, to see if there's any way to avoid the demolition by giving kind of a pause or freeze in time when there may be an opportunity to determine whether there's any alternatives to demolition. That advisory review can last, it lasts 120 days, but it's subject to a 30-day extension, so up to 150 days. The level above, but after the advisory review is over, the property owner has the option to proceed with demolition. We do not have a historic preservation ordinance that is binding on landmarked properties. The next level of protection is the certified landmark. That is a property that's been landmarked, and the property owner, only the property owner, can certify their property, and once a property is certified, then the board has to approve any demolition through what's called a certificate of necessity. So that is the type of provision where you can stop a demolition, but in order to impose that requirement on property, the property owner must have consented.
Peter, a question of some curiosity.
Yeah.
Has anybody in Lake Bluff who has sought a landmark designation certified such that they would give the board the ability to stop a demolition?
We have no certified landmarks.
Okay, thank you.
The initial step, or the initial element here, is what's known as a significant demolition review. This is when the village gets a demolition permit for property that's over 50 years and where the demolition is seeking the demolishment of at least 50% of the gross floor area of the structure. When that happens, when the property is not already landmarked, because if the property was already landmarked, it'd be in the advisory review already. The significant demolition review is when we have a non-landmark property. So we set up the process, the village set up the process that allows, when we get that paperwork that says that someone's thinking about demolishing a property of that age, it immediately kicks to the Historic Preservation Commission and a period of time that provides an opportunity up to 120 days for somebody to nominate that property as a landmark. All those, the Vliet Center, the village board, the commission, or the property owner has an opportunity to landmark the property. If the property gets landmarked, then a demolition, a further effort to demolish it would kick into the advisory review. If the property goes through that 120 days and does not get nominated, or gets nominated and for whatever reason the village did not approve a landmarking, then there'd be no restriction and the property owner could proceed with demolition. So that's the system as it's operated since it was adopted. Through the demolition process, with regard to 419, 419 Prospect, there have been some issues raised about ambiguities in our ordinance and whether they are consistent with our prior practice. So the effort to amend the code is, as it says, is to align or make consistent the submission requirements for the HPC review of significant demolitions of non-landmark properties with the information needed to consider the landmarking of property. Because remember, for 419, that's what we have. We had a demolition effort for a non-landmarked property, and that's why both processes got kicked in. These amendments, we think, clarify the purpose and process for landmark review, make it clear that that's distinct from the actual demolition permit. Our code says it right now. These amendments make it more clear. Clarifies that a property that is already landmarked is not required to go through a nomination process again. A property that's already landmarked, where there's a demolition effort, goes into advisory review. The amendments make that clear again. And the advisory review period clarifies that the advisory review period of a landmark property does not run simultaneously with the nomination. In other words, there's one period of time, once a nominated property is landmarked, then that period of time, the clock running when that had to be done by, that stops, and now we're into advisory review, and that 120 plus 30-day period kicks in.
That's the overview.
That's the overview.
Now we're going to get into the more technical details, which may not be that interesting. But they are the details nonetheless.
So the ordinance that you approved on first reading, and there's a motion to approve on second reading, is blackline to show the changes from the current ordinance, existing ordinance, to the next ordinance. The first part of the amendments are, and I think it's significant, that the first part of these changes are not to the historic preservation section or chapter of our code. They are to the section of our code dealing with demolitions. Because we have a set of regulations dealing with demolitions that may or may not impact historically significant houses. We have demolitions all the time that do not impact historically significant houses. But part of those provisions do have that provision that kicks something out that's significant, over 50% and over 50 years. And that kick out is in the building code and the demolition provisions. So this first section has what is called a demolition site management plan. That is required before a demolition permit is required. It is not required under our code before the Historic Preservation Commission considers a landmark nomination. And what that demolition site management plan has currently 8 listed items. There was some ambiguity about whether all of those needed to be required, whether all of them should be required. There was an if necessary in number 5, but not in the others. But there are other provisions of our code that clearly grant the building commissioner discretion in a number of these items. So what we did was in subsection D, we simply added the phrase, unless determined with regard to the elements that are required for a demolition site management plan, we simply added the phrase, unless determined unnecessary by the building commissioner. I would say that that language clarifies that if there's something in these 7 items that are, because of the nature of the proposed demolition are not necessary, the building commissioner, of course, has the ability to tell the property owner, you don't have to do something that's not necessary or that's irrelevant. The code already provides that the building commissioner can add to these requirements. In section, what is currently 8, what will be 7 if it's adopted, the code says a description of any other measures specifically required by the building official to reasonably minimize adverse impacts of the demolition activities on neighboring properties, public facilities, and public and private utilities and property. So these amendments would clarify the building commissioner's discretion to require more, if that makes sense, or require less, if that makes sense. We also deleted what was paragraph 7 because it was duplicative and confusing. And we eliminated in paragraph 5, the if necessary, because now the if necessary goes to the entire list of items. The next change is to 18H2, which this is where we clarify what information is required to kick into that period of time when somebody or somebody can nominate a property for landmark status that's been proposed for demolishment, as opposed to what's required for the actual issuance of a demolition permit. Those are 2 things that are separate now in the code, and we've made that process even more clear by identifying the things we need when something comes in for a significant demolition, the things we need to kick it to the Historic Preservation Commission, and the things we don't. So we've identified and made a new defined term of demolition LOI, which would require an existing site plan. A site plan is defined in the code as requiring a number of things, including, it's currently existing in the code, all buildings and structures to be demolished, the location and size of all existing buildings and structures that are to remain on the site, and all finished grades, stormwater drainage structures, and swales to drain the site on completion of the demolition work. There shall also be a tree survey submitted indicating the existing trees on the property and the trees that will be removed or impacted by the demolition project. A property restoration plan shall also be included with the submittal. So not only a site plan, a brief description of any buildings or structures on the property proposed to demolish, and photographs of the property, which will include a photograph of the property from all streets adjacent to the property. So that's the information that seemed reasonable and in past practice has been provided to the Historic Preservation Commission in order for them, upon an application for landmarking, to evaluate whether or not there's historical significance. The commission, the village, the building commissioner always has the ability to ask for more information, but that has been the minimum that has been required. It also makes clear, it also clarifies that how much you have to do in order to get to the HPC without having to go and fully do everything that you would have to do for a demolition permit. Demolition permit requires a fee, a bond, and a lot of expense, not an insignificant amount of an expense. And not only the village, but other communities that have this same process have determined that the current requirements, if they're interpreted as requiring somebody to go full out on their demolition permit in order to meet this requirement, that can be counterproductive to historic preservation because you're forcing somebody to fully invest in the demolition process before engaging in the advisory review process, which is designed to avoid demolition. Mm-hmm. And you're not eliminating the ultimate requirement that they have to submit a bond, a fee, and all this other information in order to get a demolition permit if the advisory review period and the landmarking is not successful in saving the property or saving the building.
So this doesn't eliminate the need to submit a plan for demolition, it's just the timing.
Correct,
it.
correct.
Okay.
And other things for demolition.
Right.
Location of, as we have
Yeah.
dumpsters, fencing, that kind of thing is not necessary for the historic preservation process. And so, Drew, I'm jumping around, I think, a little bit.
Is that the wrong slide for you?
18H.
This is the slide after the one we had up a second ago.
Got it, got it. So we're still on, under significant demolition applications. Does not alter the requirement that, as I said, that a complete demolition application be provided before getting a permit. And does make it clear, as we have interpreted our code in the past, that while a landmark property is subject to advisory review, an owner is not required to go back through the 90-day landmark nomination period once it's already been through it before and once it's been landmarked. And that the 90-day nomination period, it ends once there's a landmarking now, once the property has been landmarked. It doesn't keep going over that period, because that would be overlapping with the advisory review and wouldn't make any sense.
I'll cover this one, Peter.
Yeah,
That's right.
go ahead.
You get a glass of water. This amendment to section 914.6 of the code deals with the significant demolition permit in that process. And what this relates to is there's a section in the current code that's a little ambiguous, and this is again one of those areas where we're seeking clarification in the code, where it's dealing with, requires someone who has completed this significant demolition review, and they're looking to move forward, it's landmark, and they want to move forward into advisory review. It requires an affirmative action by them, as opposed to allowing those things to bleed into each other. It actually requires the person to say, hey, I have to submit something to affirm that I intend to demolish this landmark or do some alterations that would alter a landmark or potentially harm the landmark. And so that's what this is doing. It's clarifying almost, I would say, a new hurdle or trigger, if you will. It forces something that where the code is a little ambiguous, but this clarifies it. And it clarifies that the advisory review period does not begin when the significant demolition LOI is submitted.
And the only thing I would say is that's how it's been interpreted in the past. That's how it's been managed in the past, but now we're matching up the language to how it's been interpreted.
Okay. Anything else you want to add before we go?
Well, anything else, Drew? Any questions?
Questions from the board?
Can you maybe clarify a little more this point of the process and when fees are being paid?
You want me to do?
Yeah, so right now, the code is written in a way today that if you're submitting for significant demolition review, that the application requirements say that you have to submit the full fee, all fees, and that includes the price for what you estimate for the demolition fees associated with the code, as well as any demolition of a structure. It's, the large demolition taxes are all required at that time.
Right.
Even though that's when they're being paid. That's what the code says today.
Right.
And we've been talking with other communities, and that's not done anywhere else. The idea, again, is the concern is that if you get that invested into a demolition, you may be headstrong at that point to say, I've already paid my fees. I'm going to
Go through it,
despite what happens through advisory review or through demolition review conversations.
So someone could go through the process as we've intended, and we do find an alternative way to deal with this project without demolition. They've already paid up front for that, for all of that. And what we're doing is we're saying, We'll collect those fees when we've gone through that process and determined that there's no other way. That way, the homeowner or whoever owns the property feels they have some flexibility up in the end to go and change what their plan is without thinking, oh my gosh, I'm gonna lose all of all that we paid for. And I think what these other communities are probably doing, and maybe I'm wrong about that, is they're trying to stretch that as long as they can to give people as much incentive as possible to not go forward with the demolition plan. They can find some alternative that works.
Or to take a disincentive away. Or
Yeah,
to-
right.
Looking at it either way. It could be a disincentive
No.
if you'd already paid the fees.
And
exactly.
we also, another fee.
Disincentive to change your mind, exactly.
This new procedure that's being included in this letter of intent, demolition letter, we talked about internally about the idea of whether or not to recommend or not recommend a fee associated with that process. For the same reasons, it's one of those, it could go either way, pros and cons with doing it. And a concern we heard from another community is where they had a fee similar to this, and that during a heyday of tear downs, that realtors and property owners were coming forward and trying to get pre-approval to see if they can get a house that could be torn down and get that accomplished and make that part of the marketing materials, already approved for demolition. And that community struggled with that incentive, disincentive, and they still haven't charged for that. And I think that's one of the things that this ordinance that's laid out in front of you does not include a demolition letter of intent fee. That's something you can obviously keep an eye on. We're certainly not in the heyday of demolitions like the village was, like the world was in 1998 or 2003. But the idea, if that becomes an issue where people are trying to seek pre-approval and maybe don't have the true intent to do it,
Right.
and that's not to say that the letter of intent doesn't have costs, because there are some costs with that, developing
Yeah,
a site
on our
plan, and
part,
I mean, it's not a walk in the park necessarily, but it's not having those fees attached to it,
Well,
so.
the worst thing that can happen is we put that work in, we spend that time, we spend that money, the village does, to go through that process. But in the end, if we've talked the homeowner out of it, and therefore don't collect the fees, then that's perhaps a better objective, it's a better result.
Well, I think, fees have two purposes. One is cost recovery, but the other is to influence an outcome.
Right.
So in other words, we've got a very progressive schedule for false alarms.
Right,
At the upper level, we're not recovering costs, we're trying to encourage a behavior.
Yeah,
So-
right, exactly.
So I think we have to be careful that there are two objectives for fees, and cost recovery is not the only objective.
That's a good point, Paul.
However, we do know if they do decide, for whatever reason, to go through with the demolition, then all the fees, everything else kicks in.
Yeah.
Racks up.
So knowing that would incentivize them, if they go through the process of the review, then knowing that if they still want to tear down, there's a big cost to pay at the end.
They've got
right?
that cost hanging in
Yeah,
front of them.
so they may be more incentivized to find another option in that review period before that actually happens.
I'm going through this and comparing the two paths, the process paths. Substantively, the milestones are there in either case. What we've done is to reshape a few of them. We've kind of streamlined the path to make it a little more rational, I think. And that's one observation on my part. The other one, it gave some thought to this notion of the building commissioner's discretion. And I would say that in addition to the trust that we place in the building commissioner, there is an appeal process that's available either through the ABR or the PCCBA, depending on the particular set of circumstances, or coming to the village board to try to satisfy this from a political standpoint. So there is a certain counterpoint tension, I think, that still remains with the trust that we impose on the village administrator doing business as the building commissioner. So, 2 observations on my part.
Anybody else? I think the intent of this ordinance is to determine exactly and to clarify exactly what information does the Historic Preservation Commission need to determine if something is historically or architecturally significant to our community. What do they need? And there's some things in there, I think, that has been determined or decided. I don't need to know, and they don't need to know, in a whole, if you put in the entire plan for demolition permit, then the whole thing, if you put that out there for the whole building site, what's gonna happen? I don't think the Historic Preservation Commission, this is my observation, needs to know where the porta potties are gonna be placed, because that doesn't have any relevance to the historic or architectural thing, which is their purview. And some of this other stuff is not the purview of the HPC, it is the purview of the village. And that takes place when they go through the whole demolition process and getting the building permits and everything else. There's a whole set of rules, as there is with tree ordinance and everything else, as I understand. Am I correct in that?
Yes.
Okay. All right. And that's how I see it. Okay. Any other questions? Does anyone in the community have anything they would like to say? Sure, come on up.
Just plug that in. Okay, goes in this one, Glenn. Yeah, right there. I think you had it right the first time. Let's see. Oh, that actually is good, wow. I need to have one of these at home.
Jeez. Looks like northern Minnesota.
It was standard on the new Safari, and I like that one in particular because of the island. It's kind
Looks like the boundary waters.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Let me get the presentation up. It should come up, and I should be able to do it this way. Give me just a second, if you would, please. Presto Magica. Okay, great. Okay, very good. So my name is Ed Wynn, and I live at 502 East Prospect, as I think everyone knows. One of my favorite business books is Start With Why by Simon Sinek. The key message in that book is that for people to understand the what and the how, you have to start with the why. I'll be honest, I didn't do that when I was here 2 weeks ago on the 26th, so I'd like to do it now. I think there are a lot of misconceptions about why we are here, why I am here, advocating with such vigor against these changes to the building code, and why we're prepared to go to court to challenge the ABR decision about the demolition application for 419 East Prospect. So let me try to clear that up. We want to protect our health and we want to protect our homes. And we want to make sure that the village will keep the existing protections of the building code that are designed to do that. Yes, we'd also like to protect historic homes and create a balance in new housing developments that are more in keeping with the character of the village and which increase everyone's property values. We are not, contrary to what some may think, litigious people. If we have to litigate this, it will be the first time that I've ever done that personally, and I'm a lawyer. And to be clear as well, we started this by trying to work with the building commissioner to resolve the issues that we had. But when we were told that he could decide what laws he would follow, and there was nothing we could do about it, we appealed his decision to the ABR. And again, we were basically told we were nosy neighbors that shouldn't be allowed to challenge us. So I know one of the questions that came up is that there's the protection of the appeal to the ABR. What I'd ask the board to look at is look at the record of that proceeding, and you'll see that that didn't really give us a fair shake. And we're doing this to try to get the village to do something really simple: enforce its own ordinances and protect our rights. But we keep getting told, in essence, to just sit down and shut up because we're creating controversy. That was and is incredibly frustrating. I'd respectfully ask you to put yourselves in our position. What would you do in this situation where you know that the village isn't doing what it clearly should be doing and could affect your health, your home, and the response is you don't have the right to say anything about it? That's tough. And I want to be clear about another misconception, that we're somehow against Lake Bluff or against Lake Bluff government. Nothing could be further from the truth. Mary and I have lived here for almost 30 years, and many in our group have also lived here that long, some even longer. Among us, we have demonstrated our support for the village, including dedicating, like each of you, hundreds, if not thousands of hours to improve the village. While others can share their stories, let me briefly share mine, or at least a part of it. As some of you may know, in 2005, our daughter suffered severe heart failure caused by a virus. That same condition has taken the lives of 3 other children in our community. Thankfully, she recovered, but as she did, it was important for us to have dependable air conditioning in our home. As you know, if you lived here in the late 1990s and the early 2000s, electric reliability was pretty bad, among the very worst according to data in the ComEd region. So I went to then Village President Christine Letchinger and Village Administrator Kent Street, and they supported my strategy to get ComEd to invest in Lake Bluff to make our electrical service more reliable. I fought then too, and we were able to get ComEd to invest $500,000 in Lake Bluff to take our service from among the worst to among the best. ComEd was a tough customer. They even challenged my advocating for the village since I wasn't a village official. So Christine named me to a 1-member ad hoc village committee, the Ad Hoc Committee on Electrical Reliability, I think it was called. So when Christine asked me to serve as a police commissioner, I gladly did so. And I did so for more than 12 years. And I think people would tell you, I was always focused on making decisions that were in the best interest of the community, and I think our police department and I think our village was and is better for it. So why would I get from that point to the point of potentially having to sue the village? It's not because of a disagreement about a policy issue. There can be reasonable disagreements about policy, like whether the village should or should not permit short-term rentals. This isn't that. It's not an issue about what the law should be, but about what the law is and why Lake Bluff isn't following that law. And it's troubling when the village board responds by trying to quickly change the law to remove the requirements that weren't being met, rather than take the time to carefully reflect on the undisputed facts that came out during this process and to make sure that the village is following the law. I also know we're in a difficult situation. We're challenging a decision by a village official. While I can say it's not personal, and it's truly not, I also understand that it's impossible for me or anyone to demonstrate that a village official isn't following the law without it being perceived as personal. However, maybe I can change that perception a little bit and that approach. So tonight what I'm going to do is I'm going to review facts with you in light of the current and proposed code, and then propose some concerns we have from that analysis in a question format. All I'd ask is that you consider those questions before you make your decision tonight. Our biggest concern, if the village won't protect us when it's legally required to do so, what hope do we have that the village will protect our health and our properties when the village is no longer required to? We urge you to review the facts and review the code. We even urge village residents to review the facts and review the code. You don't need to be a lawyer to do that. Look at the meeting packets on the village website and even ask the village to provide you with the responses to the FOIA requests that I've received. 2 last things before I review these facts with you in the presentation, and it will be brief. In response to my most recent FOIA request, there was an email that set out the duties and responsibilities of a village trustee. I think each of you have probably been given them. They focus on your responsibilities to the village government and to the village administration, but there are 2 things missing. Your duties to your constituents, the people of Lake Bluff, all the people of Lake Bluff, and the duties that you undertook when you took the oath required by the Illinois law and the Illinois Constitution when you first became a village trustee. I do solemnly swear or affirm that I will support the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution of the State of Illinois, and that I will faithfully discharge the duties of the office of the trustee of the Village of Lake Bluff to the best of my ability. As you listen to the facts that I present tonight, I would ask that you keep those two sets of duties in mind, your duty to the people of Lake Bluff and your duty to uphold the laws. Let those duties, the true legal duties of your position, guide your decision not only on this issue, but on all the issues you decide as village trustees. Finally, before we review the data, I want to address another issue. We're in, and I realized this over the weekend, in a real catch-22. The village has told us that we can't really do anything when the house is being torn down and the new one built, even if they don't follow the rules, for legal reasons, standing, mootness, whatever else has been thrown at us. And then once the house is built, we really can't say anything because that's offensive to the person that bought it. We don't have any issues against anyone who buys these houses. We have an issue with people that build them without following the requirements of the code. So how and when do we get to discuss that issue, the issue about tear downs in compliance with the building code, without it being viewed as offensive? That's what we're looking for. But given those concerns, and because we value our neighbors, tonight the data I'm going to show you is aggregate only as part of the public presentation. I have specific data that includes each of the properties, and we'll talk about this in a minute. It does not include any photos, so everyone can rest assured that's not an issue. And we'll go through this in light of the presentation I'm now going to provide. Trustee Toll, would you mind passing this down? Again, I'm giving this to you in the interest of transparency so that my work can be checked, because I have no problem with it being checked. So I want to talk briefly about the proposed amendments to the code. And let's start with, very similar to what Peter and Drew did, I would like to give my perspective on the proposed changes and then share with you an analysis of permit review under the existing code. You might ask, how did I get this data? This data is in response to a FOIA request, and we'll talk about that in the presentation as well. So there are two things here. I agree with what has been said so far. There are two things that are happening. The creation of this demolition letter of intent for HPC review. Instead of requiring a demolition application, it requires only a demolition LOI for both the landmark review period and the advisory review period, and it requires a separate demolition LOI for existing or new landmarks. I think that's agreed. It removes the mandatory requirements of the demolition site management plan regardless of whether a landmark is required, and I think that was also discussed. So here are my position on these changes. First, I do think that the demolition LOI makes the current ordinance weaker by not requiring an application, let alone a completed application. However, I would say this. I understand why the board would want to streamline the process, and I understand the arguments that, in fact, it should provide the information that's needed as part of that process. I don't disagree with that. The issue is that being provided? And that's one of the issues. I believe one of the issues was is the tree survey being provided as part of that? I think Village President O'Hara, you mentioned that. We're going to see some data that it's really not. And so the issue is, what are we getting? What should we get? Fundamentally, though, do I disagree that with the concept of a demolition LOI and that it should include what is required for the HPC's review? No. Here's the one issue I do disagree with, is I do think there should be some fee. I agree with the comments that it shouldn't be punitive. That is going to serve no purpose. But there are costs that the village incurs to review these demolition LOIs with the HPC. It does require work of the village administrator, and I think there should be some nominal fee. The concern is with no fee, I think this was stated as well, that people would pre-approve demolitions. I think with no fee, they're absolutely going to pre-approve demolitions because there's no cost to doing so. So I just asked the village to consider that. Now as to the demolition site management plan. It allows the building commissioner to eliminate one, more, or all of the current code requirements on the plan. It says if he deems them not to be necessary. There's no standard required. There's no finding that's required. It's just his discretion. It eliminates the requirement for the DSMP to include provisions to minimize adverse impacts. Rather, those can only be included, I think as Mr. Friedman noted, if the building official requires them, and that is an obligation, or a right that he has, not an obligation. Since the DSMP is part of a demolition application, and it would no longer be required to initiate HPC review, we really don't understand why we're making changes to that part of the ordinance based on the stated rationale. Specifically, these changes remove guaranteed protections for neighboring property owners: tree protection, contamination protection, and drainage issue protection. These have no effect on the HPC reviewer designation. So what I did is I analyzed recent demolition applications, 2015 to the current date, and based on that, and I'm going to show you the data, and you have it in front of you, but I'm going to provide the summary aggregate data on the screen. The review of these at this point gives us no confidence in the ability or willingness of the village to protect neighboring owners' property rights. Here are the current code provisions, and we won't read them, but they're up on the screen so you can see that these are actually from the code. It says that every application for a permit, including a demo permit, has to be accompanied by fees, deposit or bond, and a demolition site management plan. And again, those are the full sites, and it does say it's submitted at the time of the application. That's what the code provides. For demolition projects, and this is the new section of the code once the amendments that were passed in 2016 have been codified, also says that there will be a tree survey submitted, and it includes trees that will be removed or impacted by the demolition project. As we'll see, this is not happening, and it hasn't happened since 2015. And then finally, this is the provision about construction and demolition debris, and it clearly says when submitting for a permit, this information must be provided. It is not. This basically says who's responsible. It basically says that they have to be dealt with. And for whatever reason, we're not getting these in, and there's no consequence to it, including the very limited consequences under the code. So here's the analysis. I'll do the setup, and then we'll talk about it at an aggregate level. On November 8th, 2018, I submitted a FOIA request. A little more words around it than this, but basically it was for submitted demolition applications from 2015 to the current period, the application when it was deemed complete, and then that application when it was deemed to be approved. The November 30th response, I received quite a number of documents, and I received this general response. Our records do not allow us to identify the various iterations of each significant demolition application that you see in your request. Attached to the responsive records which we located, which includes all those in the village building files as well as at each application as it was transmitted to the HPC. So I believe I got everything, and that would include basically the application file for every demolition permit 2015 to the current. So here's what it found, and then some more details on what you have. In 0 of 25 instances, no fee or bond was paid at the time of the application, even though that was clearly required. In one case, it wasn't paid until more than 2 years after the application was filed. In 0 of 25 instances was a complete DSMP or even a document labeled a DSMP provided. And that is even in what was represented as the application is approved.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
What is the 25? It's demolitions?
So yes, yes, Trustee Lemieux, let me explain that. And if you count on there, if I did it correctly, and again, if I didn't, I'll gladly admit I didn't. I went through each of the files
for the demolition applications that were supplied in response to my FOIA request. I excluded 419 because we talked about that. I excluded a couple that appeared not to be a significant demolition. And so the resulting set were 25 different significant demolition applications that were produced in response to my request, excluding, I believe, 3 that, in looking at the file, didn't seem to be a significant demolition application, and 419. So this does not include 419.
And were these demolitions that went forward, or these were just applications?
I could not tell from the application if they went forward. I believe, just looking at them, approximately 20 of them went through, but I don't have the data to do that. That would be a really good question for the village. But based on just the street addresses that were provided, I believe about 20 of these went through. And again, I didn't have the full information to see that, and obviously it would be available, I would think.
One more follow-up question to that.
Sure.
I would assume, since you don't know the disposition of whether there was a demolition or not, I know a couple of these were only significant demolitions because they were major renovations and additions. Do you have any information about that, as opposed to actually tearing the building down?
Yeah, the only thing that I can go on is the definition of significant demolition application, and I think we saw it up on the screen, which means 50% of the exterior or of the house is demolished. So I just relied on, I asked for all the ones that were significant demolition applications, so I relied on whatever the village assumed those to be, looking at the code, and that would say to me 50% or more of the floor area, which I think is correct. Okay? And then the last point, in 0 of 25 instances was the required debris information provided. And again, the code requires that that be submitted at the time of the application. Most disturbing was this. Environmental protection. This is required for neighbors and for workers. So there was asbestos testing only in 7 of the 25 demolitions, or 28%. And in those 7, asbestos was found in 6 of those 7, or 86% of those that were tested, asbestos was found.
Mr. Nguyen, let me interrupt you. Do you have information as to whether the other of the 25, other than the 7, were houses of an era such that asbestos was contained?
Based on the information that was there, I believe that most of them were, because they were more than 50 years old. And I know that because with the files, and you'll recall from the response that I got back, and again, I just have to go on the records I received, it included the HPC file. To be required to go to the HPC, I believe, and someone will correct me if I'm wrong, the building has to be more than 50 years old. So if I take 2018 and I take 50 away from that, I'm clearly before 1979, which is the date that I'm pretty sure, because I used to do this work, where asbestos-containing materials are presumed. So I'm just going on what I was supplied. So if I saw a Historic Preservation Commission packet in there, I assumed that the property was 50 years old or older. That led me to believe that it was within that particular time frame. The lead analysis, that was only done in 1 of 25, these 25 cases, or 4%, and it was found in that one.
Was dust remediation required in these 25?
Dust remediation was required in that one. I don't know if it was required in all of them. And Trustee Lemieux, I think it depends on the amount of lead that's there. The reason why I know that from personal experience is, and some of you may remember when this was done on our house, it was covered in plastic. We had to have the layers of paint removed from our house, and we had to do it with the EPA lead approval. And in that case, dust was not acceptable. It depends on the area that's being removed and other factors, and those require more detailed, you basically have to put plastic over, you have to have an approved contractor, there's many different things that you have to do, so I believe it varies based on my own personal experience, based on the amount of surfaces that contain lead.
So does I thought we required dust control regardless of whether lead was present or not.
I believe that you do.
So to me, the lead analysis is irrelevant if we're controlling the dust. I mean, we almost make the assumption that there's always lead there.
I don't think that's true from the packets that, of the materials that were received. I think that would be absolutely correct, though. I would agree with that.
Mr. Nguyen, do you have information as to whether asbestos precautions were taken in the 25 instances, or whatever number of them may have resulted in actual work being done?
No documents were provided to me with that information.
And have you done any independent investigation to reveal whether such asbestos remediation was done or not done?
I wouldn't have any access to be able to do that.
Has anybody made any point to you about that asbestos remediation being done or not done?
Other than what's revealed in the documents, no. So some of the documents you'll see there, for some of the properties, there was only a visual survey done and no testing. That's not a very good practice, and in fact, in every case where a visual inspection was done, no asbestos was found. In one of the cases, there was a card from an asbestos remediation vendor, but no evidence of a report in the file.
Do you need to do a report to do remediation?
My experience, again, because we've had asbestos remediated from our home, the practice, as I understand it, at least we applied it based on what we were told the rules were, is that you have to have testing done when it's suspicious material, and then after it's remediated, you have post-remediation testing. I have those in our files, so we can prove that, you know, when it comes the day that we'll sell our home. So that's my understanding of the requirements. The other contaminants, 1 out of 25, that's 4%. It was the same one in which the lead analysis was done, and it was found in 101, one of those. I know you're going to ask me what that is. It is in the documents. That's probably the subject of a discussion with the village, but it did involve leaking underground storage tanks, and that's documented in the report that was received. In that one, they did a full Phase 1 environmental, and I'm not suggesting that a Phase 1 environmental should be done for all of these, but in that one, it did find that particular issue, and that's available in the documents that was supplied to me, and I'd be glad to supply it as well. The tree survey protection was complete in 10 of the 25 instances, 40%, partial, 4 out of the 25, 16%, and in the plurality, it was not provided in 11 out of 25. Whether there was either a complete or partial survey, only 2, that's 14%, provided survey and protection for off-site critical root zone trees. That's really significant because the current code, as you looked at it most recently in 2016, clearly requires that those off-site trees that could be impacted by the demolition should be included in the tree survey. Those were not included in the vast majority of these, nor were they included in 419, which is one of the issues we have. Other factors and observations from the review of the documents. The building commissioner does not have a checklist, I think he admitted that, or provide applicants with complete information about the requirements. What's my basis for that? I know I'm gonna have to provide that for all that, and I'm glad to do that. If you go on the website and you pull down what you need to do when you're applying, it doesn't have this list of requirements. No rationale, when I looked through the files, was given for waiving one or more of the requirements or not obtaining complete required information. With the exception of 419, it doesn't appear that the building commissioner has ever found that an application was not complete. There was an engineering memorandum in 36% of the files, but no indication that it resulted in any changes or additional information from the applicant before approval. The building supervisor reviewed 12% of the application. There was a memo to that effect, but no indication that that review resulted in any changes or additional information from the applicant before approval. Now, maybe some of this is sloppy record keeping, but I was told I was given all the documents, and those were what I found. With 419, and to his credit, the building commissioner admitted that the process was sloppy, and I think we could all agree with that. But here's the takeaway from looking at all these documents, and again, as long as I'm legally allowed to do this, anybody can see the FOIA response that I received, both the request I made and the response. That process was not materially different in the 25 other significant demolition applications since 2015. That's what's really worrisome. And what's really worrisome, and you can look at this video, the reference is there, at the ABR hearing, the process was not correctly represented. It was represented, all these things are done before the permit is granted. And based on the records received directly from the village, they're not. And that's the issue that we have. We're just asking that the village follow the law. So here are our concerns and our questions that we pose for the evening. Significant demolition applications are not meeting the code requirements. Timely payment of the fees, and again, I get the policy considerations about bringing it up or not paying the fees, but I think for other residents, when we file for a permit or we ask for something, we have to pay the fee. We just had our air conditioning and heaters installed, and we had to pay for that fee before the work could begin. So we just like equal treatment. I understand that those fees are expensive, and maybe they could be broken up in categories where ones that relate to the required permit review are paid initially, and things like the impact fee, which I know is large, could be paid at the time that the demolition is approved. We'd like to have, and this is why we object to the portion of the ordinance that makes the DSMPs discretionary. We think, not for purposes of the Historic Preservation Commission, but for purposes of making sure we have approved significant demolition applications that meet the requirements and specifically protect other neighbors, workers, that a complete DSMP that meets all of the requirements needs to be provided, and particularly around tree surveys, environmental impacts, and drainage. Those are really important. I think we would all agree. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Apologies. So I get confused about this. I thought that the proposed process does require a DSMP. It is the timing of the DSMP, but you seem to be presenting that one isn't going to be required.
That's correct, Trustee Lemieux. It is, I don't disagree with the portion that says it doesn't have to be provided for HPC review, but the language change, what it says right now is it says the DSMP, and remember, that's for ones that go through HPC review and ones that don't. Anything that's a significant demolition application. It right now says it shall include at a minimum, and it lists 9 items.
Right.
What's being proposed is taking away that shall at a minimum language and put, unless the building commissioner, I'm trying to get the right wording, I'll get corrected if I don't, determines it is not necessary or something to that effect. That's the problem we have. The problem we have is that under that, with no requirement for a standard in which he's going to determine it's necessary, having to even put that in writing, and based on the history of the demolition permits from 2015 continuing to today, we don't believe that we're being adequately protected, because these things, particularly the 3 we've talked about, are not there to protect us as neighbors. That's what we want. That's really what we want.
Mr. Nguyen, I'm sorry, a follow-up question. One of the concerns that I always have in this role in municipal government is that we take fair account of the limits and propriety of what we attempt to regulate. And certainly you've raised some issues here, asbestos I'm sure is foremost among them, in which the regulatory space may, it would seem, a fair conclusion, be occupied by state and or federal regulation. So my pointed question for you is this: are any aspects of what you raise already mandated by state or federal law, such that anything that we say here really is redundant or duplicative?
It's a very good question. I thank you for asking it. Actually, do you know the answer to that? Because I've spoken with both the person in charge of EPA lead regulation and EPA asbestos regulation. And here's what they tell me. Unless the property, and I'm glad to provide the contact information to the village for this, but I think you can look it up as well. Unless, if it's a residential property situated on less than an acre, they do not regulate that. The issue under the code is, and I think I put this in one of the papers that I filed, is that the code does have in other sections requirements about contaminants. I think they talk about them in terms of pollutants, I have to go back and look at it, but there are specific toxic substances and hazardous substances. Now I'm remembering. So there are other provisions in the code about that. Those are also deemed nuisances under the code, and that's an important part. I know you're trying to avoid litigation. I'm trying to avoid it too. If this goes out, basically what residents are going to be left with is filing nuisance actions against each other. I don't think that's good public policy. I think neighbors ought to support each other, and I think we ought to be focused on protecting each other's health and increasing the value of our properties, to be honest. And so I think it's appropriate for the village, given the whole context of all the ordinances, that you help us with that. And I think that's one of the things that I've been disappointed about as well, and it's happened a couple times, and again, since you mentioned it, I'm going to raise it, is I think there's a feeling among the village, if there's an issue about compliance with the building code or anything else, quite frankly, that residents should kind of report that. I don't like being a snitch. I think that puts residents in a very uncomfortable position to basically, and there are statements on the record to this effect that this is how the village does this, is basically wait for residents to identify where somebody's doing something against the code without a permit, where they're violating other provisions of the code. And, that puts us in a really uncomfortable position. Trust me, I understand how uncomfortable that position is after the last 48 hours. So I don't want to have a situation where it's neighbor against neighbor. That's not the point. I think we really need to count on our village and count on our administration to help protect us in these ways and not to require residents to police each other on this, because that's going to lead to a lot of things that are unpleasant. So these are the requirements that we don't believe are being met and that we think should be met. Again, the history is that they're not, and so we need to make sure that they are, and that's our biggest concern. So what are the effects of this? We could go, one of the results could be right now, all these demolition permits that these things weren't done, they might be invalid. There are fees or fines that are required to be assessed if compliance isn't required, not against the resident, against the developer, and those haven't been assessed, collected, or even considered. And there could be contingent liability to the village for potential environmental claims. That's in nobody's interest because taxpayers, we have to come out for that. So here are my concerns about the village response, and this will be the end, and I'll be glad to take, there's just 2 more slides after this, but it's wrapping up. I'll be glad to take any other questions. What we've been concerned about is the village response to the review and identification of these issues. Does the village want to review the facts and assess what those facts say, or push back against residents for obtaining and informing the village of these facts? Does the village want to ensure compliance with the existing ordinances, or remove identified compliance issues from ordinance requirements? Does it want to protect the rights of all property owners, or just protect the rights of developers? Does it want to provide an adequate opportunity for resident and advisory board input on code changes or proposed changes over a holiday weekend and do not seek the advice of village advisory boards? The biggest concern of all to us is why. As I said, I've lived here 30 years, almost 30 years. It'll be 30 years next year. I've always thought the village was here to protect the residents, particularly in these health and safety items. And as I said, from my history with the village, it's been there to support me when I've needed that in the past. What we're asking is that it's there again for me and for the other residents. So working together to better Lake Bluff for everyone is the goal. Raising controversial issues should not be discouraged for the sake of consensus or unity if the cost of doing so is to ignore the facts, the law, or government transparency and accountability. Thank you very much for your time.
Ed, before you step down, I've got a couple of questions out of curiosity, I guess, more than anything that you might be able to answer. Do you happen to, having gone through it yourself, do you happen to know the cost of the lead and asbestos testing and analysis, both before and after remediation?
Yes, and can I give you the additional support for why I know that? So not the current job I'm in, but the prior job that I was in, I was the general counsel of Stepan Company, a global chemical manufacturer, and in that role, I was responsible for global EHS&S, employee health, safety, and security. And so I'm very familiar with the environmental requirements and what's done, particularly for asbestos. So the cost of the testing is relatively minor, at most a few $100s. It's the remediation that costs. That's really what it is. The testing is maybe $250, $400, somewhere in there. It's not that expensive. Same for the lead. It's the testing part of it is not the big cost. It's the remediation once something is there. And trust me, that's not cheap. The lead remediation just from our, and yes, we made sure it was very much because we have small kids that live next door. That was, the remediation was probably $5,000. So yeah, it's a lot, but that $5,000 pales in comparison if somebody's going to get sick. And with asbestos in particular, you don't even know from the time of exposure to the time of symptoms. That can be 10 years, 20 years. That's why you have all those asbestos cases going on. So yeah, that's the testing is relatively minor. I think I can say this without getting in trouble. We've had discussions with the owner of 419, and we talked about the testing and the cost for that, and he would agree with me that the testing is relatively minor.
Okay. And then I guess my other curiosity question is, if the EPA doesn't regulate these residential properties less than an acre, is there even a standard for post-remediation analysis?
There is. So again, you might all think that we're pretty particular about things, but I don't think that's necessarily bad. So just like radon, asbestos, lead, there are very standard post-testing requirements. And in fact, in the few number of applications where that testing was done, they have that certificate. Basically, it shows, and you'll see it in there, it shows what the pre was, what the post was, and I think they do a second post. And again, that just gives you certainty that there's nothing there. And yes, we have had our home tested for radon, and luckily we're below the level, well below it. But we just think those things are important. And we did that at our house too, because we at that time had small kids, and you're not going to expose anybody. We weren't going to expose the workers either. That's just not who we are.
Thank you.
Mr. Nguyen, another one. This is another question. This is a broader question, but one that I think might be helpful to me as a trustee as I try to better understand, what our future options might be in Lake Bluff as to historical preservation. I'm curious, why did you and your neighboring group not elect the greater protection of a certified landmark?
Here's the reason why, and thank you for addressing that, was asking that question. I had it down on my notepad to address. And I did talk about this, I think it was the HPC, somebody will correct me. There is an ability to get certain benefits by being in a federally protected district. The way that those work is you can't have any significant restriction on your home, or otherwise you're ineligible for those. So I know there's varying interpretations of that, but my interpretation, and I've checked and contacted the right agencies, and I think I got the right answer, is that if we designate our landmark, because at the end of the day, that's a delay, not a requirement that you can't demolish, that you can still do that and still apply for the federal protections as a district or otherwise. If you get the certified one, because it puts a restriction on your home that prevents the significant demolition or the change or alteration, you have to do that in lieu of the federal benefits that are there. So I think why I would guess, I can only say in my case and a couple of the neighbors, why we haven't done that is because we're exploring the idea of a district, and so we don't want to preclude that from occurring and from those benefits applying. And if you look at the tax code, that's kind of how it's written, and that's the understanding. Currently, the village doesn't provide any benefit other than you get a break on certain fees, construction or permit fees, I believe, and there may be some limited tax abatement, but it's not anywhere near what is provided at the federal level.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
I think it would be helpful if Mike, can you come up, Mike Croak? And just, I didn't, I mean,
One thing we have, we recite petitions, I'll just hand those over.
As Mr. Nguyen stated, he did file a Freedom of Information Act request. We processed that. I'm not certain how Mr. Nguyen analyzed that data and made the conclusions, or drew the conclusions that he came to. I haven't had that conversation with him. But what I wanted to do is talk about that he and I were clearly publicly disagreed on what a complete application looks like. So to start off with why 0 of 25 were incomplete, that's a good place to start because we disagreed on what was complete, and we talked about the discretion that's already in the code for the village building commissioner to review these applications and determine what's complete or appropriate given the situation. And Mike, would you talk about that and generally thinking about how we provide protection following the village's tree regulations and some of these environmental concerns that were raised and how those are typically managed and how you do that as the building code supervisor?
Sure. We require dust control for all demolitions, and there's not necessarily any paperwork in the file that says that. It's notes on the plans, typically, but that's something that is done. And we do require the asbestos paperwork, which I believe they also have to do to haul their waste to the landfill, so they have a licensed state asbestos inspector do an inspection and a remediation of their house before demolition. And as far as lead, I mean, we always require dust control of some form, which is what the US EPA recommends. If you have lead, we require it whether you do or don't have lead, which
So test or no test?
Right, test or no test. We require the dust control either way.
Okay. And as far as the tree protection, I know we review those internally and review them as situational depending on the conditions of the property. And if somebody puts up a tree protection fencing plan that avoids even touching the neighbor's property, then they may not have specific tree drip lines shown on a plan.
Correct. That's correct. Yep.
So,
Could I respond to that briefly?
Yes.
I'm sorry.
I agree that that would be appropriate things to have if we had them. But again, please look in the file. We don't have the asbestos stuff in each of the files. We may have dust protection, but that wasn't even initially included in the one for 419. That was something that was added after my initial review of the application. So what the concern is, yeah, we hear a representation, it's all taken care of, trust us. We think it ought to be in the documentation. And so either it's somewhere else and it wasn't produced in response to my FOIA request, which is a different issue, or it's just not done. And I have to rely on the village. I think Glenn has done an exceptional job in responding to quite a number of FOIA requests that I've lodged against the village, and I believe I have everything. But again, I'm glad, and I think legally I can do it because I think they're all public records. Any of you can see the responses I've gotten to each and every one of my FOIA requests and see for yourself.
Mr. Nguyen, before you step down, I'm sorry, I don't mean to turn this into question and answer thing, but
That's
I guess
okay.
I do want to have a better understanding of this. I'm looking at the document that you've tendered to us that's entitled, or the part of it that's entitled Environmental Review with Significant Demolition Applications. And you've got a column for property and the next to it a column for asbestos testing. And in that column for asbestos testing, there's no's and yeses and so on. In the instances in which there is a no, is that your indication that there was nothing in the file to indicate asbestos testing, or is that your indication that asbestos testing was not done based upon what was in the file?
It is both, and I can't remember the version I gave you because of the concerns that were raised over the weekend. I didn't even put in the name of the contractor. But there is one contractor here in the village that only does the visual inspection. And so in my complete file, I think I have that name. So yes, there were instances, and I believe it was 7, but I can get that information to the village, where there was only a visual inspection done, but no testing. And in the one case I think I mentioned, all I found in the file was a card from that same company, but no report either as to a visual inspection or as to any testing.
Okay, what I'm trying to drive at here, Mr. Nguyen, and I guess this will be in the form of a question as well, is do we, based on what you have looked at, have a record-keeping issue or an actual administrative issue with respect to these issues?
And I don't know the answer to that. What I can tell from 419, because I've been really involved in that, is it was both. There was no appearance that it was getting done, and there's also poor record keeping. In fact, I think, subject to check, and someone will correct me, I think that was the only application in which somebody reviewed it, and it's the only one as a result of that review that the building commissioner determined twice that, in fact, it wasn't complete. So I'm just going on what information that I have, but I would think that the village would want that documentation to be in the file. One of the other concerns that this gives me, and it's one that I raised during the process, is, you know, having managed processes like this before, actually, to be honest, some more complicated ones, but some less complicated ones too, I always used a checklist. Everybody knew this is what you have to have in the file, and then you have it, and then you would see it consistently in the file. That's good auditing, and so we don't have that here. Is that a paper record requirement? Is the paper somewhere else but wasn't produced? Is the paper, where is it? Is there no paper? Is it just a handshake? Don't know. I can just go with the documents that were given to me, which were represented as everything in the application file for each of the significant demolitions from 2015 to the current date.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Anyone else? Would you like to speak, ma'am? Please.
Hello, I'm Annie Atsef. I live at 540 East North Avenue. I've lived in Lake Bluff in 2 houses on the same street for almost 20 years, and I love this town. I am active in the PTO and other local organizations, and I was incredibly dismayed by Mr. Wynn's lakebluff.us website, which you've asked for transparency from the board, yet your website that you put up that went live on December 6th did not have your name. It wasn't without much digging did we figure out that you were behind it. And I didn't find a credible apology. I don't know if anyone here went on that website. You did? Okay. So I'll give you some of the reactions. I'm sorry I'm shaking because I'm really upset. These were some of the reactions that people who visited your website. There was a this or that list, and it was a list of houses with people's picture of their house and a big block letter of their address. And it would compliment them on, look at, they did a tasteful renovation of their house, or they didn't overbuild the lines. You know, this was a good, these are the ones that we like. And then it took pot shots at houses that are already built, that families are living in, and included pictures and then addresses, and it would say, look at the, you know, inferior siding, vinyl siding, or there's no interesting architectural detail in this house. I know people that live in these houses, and that's their welcome. One couple, 2 doctors, they just had a baby, they just moved to Lake Bluff, and that's the welcome they get. They were so excited to move into this house. That is just embarrassing, like unbelievably. So I want you to hear what some people had said. I posted the link to lakebluff.us on the Lake Forest Lake Bluff news group website on Facebook. My response was, does anyone know who's behind lakebluff.us? I'm all for showcasing the houses that exemplify the characteristics of Old Lake Bluff, but what's with the naughty list? Providing pictures and addresses of houses that this group feels is not worthy of Lake Bluff? It's disgusting. One person, I agree, a judgmental invasion of privacy. The time to disapprove of a building design is before it's built, not take catty pot shots afterwards. Public shaming is not very neighborly. Wow, that's awful. Too late, they already did it. I'm assuming that these concerned neighbors didn't ask the homeowners of the properties of which they disapprove for permission to post photos of their homes and their addresses. Will this group's legal counsel be at the meeting tomorrow, which is tonight? This is unbelievably rude. Neighbors working together, how dare they disparage someone's home? They have no right to decide what is appropriate or not, whether or not an intern, because they did say at one point, someone responded back that an intern was responsible for the website, which throwing the intern under the bus is ridiculous. The website is insulting. Bringing transparency and accountability to village government doesn't go hand in hand with being a bully, which is exactly what is going on. I am full on board. I think preservation is a worthy cause. I support causes like Lake Forest Preservation, Historical Society. I've donated my time and efforts. I think it's a wonderful cause. Your tactic was so distasteful and upsetting, and some of the people that live in these houses, one of them works for the Bears, and he encourages all the staff to move to Lake Bluff, not Lake Forest, because of our schools and our community. And you listed his house on there. I don't know where to begin, but when you ask for, you're saying the changes that you would like would support our community, and you would, you want transparency, well, all I see is hypocrisy. So I'm sorry, I had to say those things, and I hope the board takes that into consideration when you consider what he's asking from you. Thank you.
Anybody? I'm not going to have tit for tat here, so hold on, Ed. We're just getting back and forth here, okay?
No, the only thing I want to say is that I did post an apology on the website.
Okay.
These comments were posted, and I did mail personal apology letters. Is this televised?
Okay, all right, guys. Excuse me. This is not a debate, folks. Okay, and the emotions can run high. Does anyone else have something to say that is pertinent to this evening? Yes, please come up.
I wasn't going to speak this evening, but my name is Stephanie Bjork. You've seen me before. I wanted to clarify a question that was asked by one of the board tonight as to whether there were any certified landmarks that didn't fall under your purview. And there are. You have multiple things in the National Register that are subject to federal law. You have multiple properties that have long existing conservation easements that are subject to federal law because there were tax dollars in some fashion, deduction and that type of thing. Those, I sent a letter off this morning to Drew when I saw the RIO that's subject to the meeting on the 19th. There are many properties listed on there that are outside the purview of your control. So I've given the documentation to the attorney and also to Ms. O'Hara. I've also given it to Drew. Various other board members are aware that my husband and I are the only successful third-party conservation easement, federal conservation easement enforcers in the United States. The IRS cites our case on their website under conservation easement enforcement guidelines, on their guidelines for review of easements. And I have to say today when I saw the RIO, I was terribly disappointed. I think the way Illinois statute is now, a property owner, as my husband and I were, is given standing. It's one of the few states, actually, that gives standing to a property owner within 500 feet. Illinois has that provision in their statute, so any property owner within 500 feet of these easements has a right to enforce and standing in court. And in addition to that, I think the new conservation easement guidelines that have been, at least are being considered, allow the Attorney General in every state to enforce on behalf of the taxpayer, because these, if you think about it, major tax deductions are given to the property owners, to the point of what you were asking about why we haven't gone forward. I made the point here before that my husband and I would hope that we could get a National Register district in the camp meeting area if we qualified. If those surveys were done and we qualified, we have offered to put that money up towards trying to get that underway, because it is not possible the way that, because of the abuses of the past, the federal government has determined that you are not able to list an individual house unless you are already in a National Registered District, which gives them some assurances that you have, that there isn't a misuse of that. So there were abuses in the past, and they've gone that route. So my husband and I would love, at some point, should we qualify, Susan Benjamin in the long past singled out 414 as significant because it is the last, to my knowledge, of the original camp meeting houses that consists of almost all of the original siding. There have been updates, obviously, but our opinion is that if the standard is, would the original homeowner have recognized it if they came back today? We believe they would. And we did extensive research on finding the old pictures, redoing the porches back to what it was. We found the original, actually, porch posts that still were there. So we would lovingly try to be the test case for that. We are I believe, the last 25-foot lot on the original camp meeting plat, still never been replatted or touched, house not altered. So we look forward to exploring that down the road with all of you, but I did want to make the clarification that you do have National Register District properties and easements with restrictive documents on them on that list that need to be, those documents. I've asked Drew to get all of those conservation easement and National Register listing documents with what the restrictions are on those properties to me, so that we can see whether they're federal easements, whether they're subject to your review, or whether it's not something that's subject to what you do here. So I appreciate your time.
Thank you.
And just to clarify, Mrs. Bjork did provide that information. We've handed off to the village council to look into. But what she's referring to, there's an upcoming zoning hearing for those that are really into zoning. But this is regarding a new potential district in the village dealing with with institutional and open space properties in the village that are most of them are currently zoned in residential districts, which kind of make it difficult for them to operate and redevelop and maintain their properties in a way consistent with those standards. But this has been talked about for years. This code RIO is what we call it, recreational, institutional, and open space. But to get that ordinance is being examined, the public hearing, as you stated, it's upcoming up at the PCZBA.
Okay. Does anybody else have anything they'd like to say?
Well, I suppose the only thing I'd say at this juncture is I'm a bit confused as to the interplay of federal, state, and municipal law, at least as it's going to impact some things like asbestos, lead, and then on a broader basis, I suppose, although it's not before us, the broader basis, the issues of landmarking. So with confusion comes caution. So I'm raising the question of whether we ought to be examining, given everything we've seen tonight, this ordinance, as to whether there is a direction that is going to make it a better one.
Does anybody else have anything they want to say?
I would have to say that, particularly with respect to asbestos and lead, I'd like to, first word that comes to my mind, and it's probably ill-advised and certainly overused these days, is fact check. A better term, I think, is the inference you had. I'd like to have a better understanding of that and the intersection between that and federal and state requirements and what our responsibilities would be as a local municipality. And for that reason, I think I'd like to postpone approval of the second reading until we have a chance to gather some additional data.
I think that was very well put by Trustee Dewart, and I suppose what I would make some observations on top of that are, if I don't want to, as a municipal official, politician, whatever the heck I am, start doing things that are going to be either redundant, and with redundancy, potentially in conflict with either state or federal regulation. So in getting a better understanding of the entire regulatory environment, one potential direction is that this ordinance is revised, may simply say something to the effect of, with asbestos or lead, you're going to follow these other regulations. You know, make a reference to the other regulatory environment. And I don't know what else, but I think I agree with Trustee Dewar. We got to understand this better, because even with a JD and an MBA, I ain't getting it right now.
Anyone else want to chime in?
And I would agree, especially with the current federal EPA, the way it is, we may want to be even more restrictive than what federal law requires. And if the burden is truly only a few $100s and a several $100,000 project to do full analysis and testing, then that might be something we could also require in a demolition permit. I do want to touch on the discretion issue, however, about the argument that giving the building commissioner full discretion in any of these issues is that if we do start enforcing the ordinance strictly without any discretion, we would probably all have many more parking tickets, maybe speeding tickets over 2 miles per hour over the speed limit. I know I'd have a dog at large ticket or two if we took away all discretion. So I would caution against being too scared of giving discretion to a trusted administrator or any of our other trusted employees.
Yeah, I'd certainly second that. I think that's a very good point. And then further to something else that Trustee Tall just said is that it may be that there is a gap here as to asbestos regulation under an acre lot and so on. I don't know the answer to that.
This
I wanna know
can't be
answer
the
to that.
first time that that people have had to deal with this. And
Yeah.
to Mr. Wynn's point, there's an obvious gap here. If the EPA is waiving under an acre, then there's something going on here that collectively we don't understand.
Yeah, and with all respect
Or
to
it hasn't been put, let's
Yeah.
put it that way.
And with all respect to Mr. Wynn, I guess I want to know the legal answer from somebody who's going to research it and show me the citation on that point, not just a phone call to the EPA.
Though,
All right, is anyone else
if you want to
here?
pass on your contact information, that would be fine.
Okay, anybody else have a comment?
I'm okay with postponing this.
You're okay with what?
I'm okay with postponing the vote, and I would second the comments to my left here that at some point we've got to give discretion. Otherwise, the process could go on forever. So there does need to be discretion. I don't know how it'll be worded in the final ordinance, but at some point we have to say somebody can call a stop or ask for an additional step or say one isn't necessary. I understand the tension that's involved in that, but I don't know any way around it.
Eric, do you
Yeah,
want?
I'm just going to add, I was fairly comfortable with what we were doing with the ordinance with regards to trying to do the right thing. I never felt that we were doing anything to make it easier for developers to do things or to short-circuit the process. However, I think the information Mr. Wynn presented was very interesting for me. I would like to delve into this. Is a little bit different topic than what I was thinking about when we originally started to do this, so I certainly would be in favor of more fact-checking. I think the ordinance needs to be, we may be adding some new sections to it, we may not, I don't know, but there are some things that we were doing in the changes that I'm still comfortable with, but I think we definitely should try to shore this thing up based on what we find.
The last comment I would have is we're faced with an interweave between historical preservation and the requirements for demolition. And in my mind, it's sort of one of these situations that has multiple intersections, but in many respects, they're independent. And we need to understand the intersections, and we need to understand the independence. And I think that by and large, my impression from the board is that we're actually very sensitive and very interested in historic preservation strategically for the village. And I think we have to be careful, collectively be careful, about how we come off as saying that certain issues related to details and whatnot related to demolition have somehow morph into being suddenly historic preservation details. And they may or they may not be. And I think we need to be cognizant of that. And finally, at the risk of being redundant and the dangers of redundancy, I would also cast my favor in terms of being able to provide the village administrator, building commissioner with appropriate flexibility and in doing his job.
Okay.
So you need a motion to defer to the next meeting?
Not yet.
Oh, okay, sorry.
I'm not done.
No, sorry.
I get to speak. I think there are kind of two issues here, and I will agree with Mark. I think the information that we have received from Mr. Nguyen needs to really be looked at. I think that we need to analyze our practices. I think that there's some things that we may have questions about. I don't have the answers. But I think we have some work to do, on one hand. On the other hand, I would like to distinguish, and I have no problem with the postponing of this at this point, but I also want to reiterate that what is necessary to determine historic preservation and architectural significance may be different than the whole process for demolition and what is needed. Mm-hmm. It's needed. The whole demolition thing, all of that is absolutely needed. But where that takes place, and I like to distinguish between what is historic, in the purview of historic preservation, as opposed to what is the village's obligation to ensure that demolition processes are taking place, that the adequate protections for the homeowners and the surrounding homeowners are there, that the environmental things are all there. My only thing is, where does that take place? And I hope no one disputes, I am extremely interested in historic preservation. Have been for 40 years. And was instrumental in the beginning of finally getting the village to pass a historic preservation ordinance and start a historic preservation. So I am interested. And it's that balance between historic preservation and progress and homeowners' rights. And that has always been the issue in our town. Where are we with that? So a couple of years ago, a little over 2 years ago, I did ask the Historic Preservation Commission to look into our preservation ordinances, which I will be honest, if I said for years I thought were rather weak. I thought we needed to look at that. I asked them to do that, compare that. Nothing happened at the time. In May of this year, I made some changes to the Historic Preservation Commission. I'd asked the new chair to look at two things. One is education to the community and to people that may be moving into the community of we value this character of the community. We value what our community looks like. You can't save everything, but you do have this picture of who we are, and you move here for that. So how do we balance that with also rights of homeowners to purchase their property, to make changes, and at times, reluctantly as we may be, sometimes that they will be torn down. That may be in the better interest. But that's that balance, and that is, believe me, we've struggled with that for years, and we have certainly not solved that. So I've also, besides the education piece, asked them, the new chair, and I reiterated that a week ago when I talked to him again, that I want the historic preservation to review what other communities are doing, to review ours, to make some recommendations, hold some public hearings to get community input, craft that, and then, if appropriate, make suggestions to the board where we can have dialogue with the Historic Preservation Commission based on some substance and fact. So that is the direction that we are taking. I don't know if every single thing, and I don't totally agree with some of the things that you've got there, I don't think they necessarily all belong in historic preservation ordinance. I do think that they belong and need to be done elsewhere. We do have things, and we do have to make sure that they are enforced and what is appropriate. So we do need to review that, and I think this whole board agrees, which is why we'll hold off on this at the moment. But they're kind of two things to me. That's how I see it. Both are very, very important, and both will not be neglected. That's all I can say. And the other thing is, we are neighborhoods of people. We don't need to have people's feelings hurt. We don't need to, as Annie said, people feel shame, it's how we approach things. We have to be very careful and very sensitive. What we may like, someone else may not. But we have to be sensitive to this. And we sometimes get caught up in our passions and our causes, and we forget that. And we have to kind of remember that we do all live in this town, and we all do really have, I hope, the best interests of this town at heart. So that's the end of my teacher comments, I'm sorry. But we will, I think agreement is, we will not take action tonight on that, this ordinance, and we will be looking at things and reviewing and seeing where our next steps will be. Any other questions or things?
If you think it would be helpful to the last point and consistent with what Annie said, I'm glad to put a public apology on the record.
That's between you guys. I don't want to get in the middle of that. Right. But I do think we all do need to understand each other's viewpoints, and sometimes we come from different viewpoints, and that's okay. That is okay. All right, so.
Do you need a motion?
Motion to table?
I think you can just say without objection, it'll be on the next.
Right,
We'll try to put it on the next
that will be in January, because we don't have a second one here.
No objection.
Okay,
So moved.
Anybody, is that also, okay, so all in favor of that, I'm assuming is okay. All right, so,
Welcome.
all right, we are now to trustees' report.
I just wanted to thank the caucus who ran meetings last week to nominate candidates to various boards. I attended the first night where they nominated clerk and trustee candidates, and I thought the process went very well, and democracy in action and volunteerism in action, and it went well, and I congratulate the candidates that are moving forward. 2 of them are here.
Okay. Yeah, I think we're sitting in democracy in action.
Yeah, I don't think we can understate the value that the Vote Like Bluff Committee has had in organizing these events, but also just helping get people engaged and involved, and it's been significant.
Okay. All right. Anybody else for the trustees? Okay. We don't have executive session.
We do, actually, personnel.
Personnel? Okay, I have
Do we have anything for threat litigation?
we do have something to go in for personnel for executive
Threat
session.
litigation?
So do I have a motion?
So moved.
Second.
What?
Well, yeah,
Lemieux.
include it. Threatened litigation.
And threatening litigation, thank you.
Myers.
All right, both. All right, so, all in
So moved?
favor?
Oh,
Roll
okay.
call vote.
Roll call, please, again.
Roll call?
Yeah. roll call.
Okay. Trustee Meyer.
Aye.
Trustee Toll.
Aye.
Trustee Aikman.
Aye.
Trustee Dewart.
Aye.
Trustee Grenier.
Aye.
Trustee Lemieux.
Aye.
Okay. We are now going into executive session, and everybody have a good night.